Review Body of the 8th October. I can confirm that the meeting has been properly called and is quorate. Can I please ask members to appoint a chairman for the meeting?
Altogether?
Could I propose Councillor Maitland?
Thank you, Councillor Maitland.
Right, we're off. Thank you. Thank you very much. Sorry about that. Right, now my understanding is that the clerk is going to lose her voice. And so in the first instance, I think I have to ask, make certain that the cedorant is correct and ask for any declaration of interest. Nope, nobody has any interest. Now, I think probably I'm supposed to ask you to take us through the documents and papers, but I think you have requested that you're thinking about losing your voice. In which case, I'm quite happy to read these. You keep me right, please, about which bits you would expect me to read out. Do you wish this read verbatim? Is that what we would normally do?
We would normally just give the title of the
Yes,
item.
that's fine.
And say there was key documents there and then go over.
Fine, you can keep me right. Okay, in which case then we are going to debate item number 4, which is Creetown Caravan Park, Silver Street, Creetown. A refusal of planning permission for change of use from holiday caravan park to residential caravan park, formation of bulk gas compound, erection of 10 street lighting columns, partly retrospective. That is planning application 13/P/2/0080. We have a list of contents, notice of review, report on handling, observations of interested parties and appointed officer, comments of applications agents, planning application form, decision letter, relevant extracts from Dumfries and Galloway structure plan, the local plans, the local development plan, and supplementary design guidance, photos of application site, and we have also the grounds of refusal, which are on pages 114 to 115. I'll read these. 1, that the intention to provide permanent residential accommodation at this established caravan site would contravene the terms of the development plan, Local Plan General Policies 17, 21A, 33 and 34. And secondly, that insufficient information has been provided in order to allow the planning authority to properly determine this application in light of the terms of Scottish Planning Policy Structure Plan S3 and Local Plan General Policy 58, and to draw a conclusion of whether or not the proposed permanent residential development would accord with or contravene the guidance contained therein. The second part is the requested method of determination. The applicant has requested that the review be dealt with, 1, on the basis of further written submissions, and 2, on the basis of 1 or more hearings. The grounds stated in the notice of review are, in summary, the planning history in the report of handling omits a 1994 planning permission for engineering works to banking and associated landscaping, which is relevant to flood protection. The existing tourist accommodation will not be used as residential accommodation. New residential lodges, which have been designed for residential use, would be introduced in a transitional manner, and the number of units on site would reduce from 70 to 50, which would also help with any flooding concerns. Other such development exists within Dumfries and Galloway. Creetown Holiday Park is situated within a town and would provide low-cost residences for young people to stay and live in the area. We have comments by interested parties, comments from the appointed officer, comments from the applicant's agent. We then have a list of development plan policies, all listed there, and we then go into, members, the main issues for the local review body to consider. There are 4 bullet points laid out here. Does the proposal comply with the current development plan and policies ED10 and H7 in particular? If not, are there any material considerations which would justify approving the application as an exception to policy? Has sufficient information been provided to allow the planning authority to properly assess the flood risk to permanent residences? And bearing in mind that the site is a licensed caravan site, the Council as planning authority has no control over the number, type or design of the units within the site, provided they meet the definition of a caravan in the 1960 and 1968 Caravans and Control of Development Acts. Accordingly, although the stated intentions of the applicant to have 50 new residential lodges in place of the 70 static caravans is noted, as the application is for a change of use from holiday park to residential park, the planning authority would be unable to prevent the 70 existing units being used as permanent residences if this application was granted. What weight, if any, does the local review board wish to give to this fact? Beg your pardon, we're kind of a body, aren't we? We're a body, not a board. Does the local review body wish to give to this fact? Secondly, having outlined the documents within members' papers, it now falls to the local review body to determine whether it has sufficient information to consider the review. It is confirmed that no representations from any party will be heard today. We have options available to the local review body, and we can decide, 1, whether we have sufficient information before us to enable us to determine the review today. We could request further information in the form of written representations. We are required to state precisely the information the body is seeking and who must provide it. The body can resolve to hold a hearing, again specifying who will be invited to speak and on what matters, or it can resolve to hold a site visit, accompanied or unaccompanied. This can be done in conjunction with any of the above, but would obviously not allow a decision to be made today. If the local review body resolves that it has sufficient information and that no further procedure is required, then the local review body has the full powers to uphold, reverse, or vary a determination. The decision notice will include a statement of the terms in which the planning authority has decided the case reviewed. A planning advisor is present to assist at today's meeting. It is confirmed that he did not have any involvement in either case and was not the case officer or the appointed officer for these applications. He is here purely to provide independent advice as needed on matters of planning policy, law, or process to the local review body. If members are clear, and if no further clarification is required, I will now lead the debate as chairman. And in the first instance, I will take you through the local review. I will take you through the agenda papers today together and decide if we have sufficient information for us to make a determination today. But first, I'll have a drink of water. Thank you. It's been pointed out that we can go through slides at this stage. Thank you, members.
Thank you, Chair. These are the same slides that you actually have in your agenda papers. And running through them briefly, that's a zoomed photo of the site from a distance, just showing the context of the type of caravans which are in there at the moment. This is the entrance to it from Silver Street. And again, you can see the type of static caravans which are moving further into the site. Here you're seeing some of the new stances which are going in, and also one of the lamp standards that's gone in. As is stated before, you don't actually need planning permission, provided the new developments are in accordance with the definition of a caravan, but all the other developments, such as the lamp posts, the LPG tanks and so on, aren't given those permitted development rights, so that's why they are required. Another lamp standard in situ, that's a completed one. And then you're seeing the storage for the gas compound around here. And then these are the larger tanks gone in. One little additional item which I should draw members to attention to is, because the local development plan, the LDP, has now been adopted, you're in an interesting situation, because both the items on today's agenda were obviously determined under the previous development plan, which was the structure plan read together with the local plan. So obviously, without prejudging what you wish to do as a panel, whatever decision you make, if you're going to have to view it in light of the current local development plan. So in the situation that you wish to uphold the officer's decision, you can't uphold it in terms of the actual wording that was there before. You would have to technically vary it and use the current equivalent LDP policies. But I'll keep you right if you come to that situation.
Right. Members, I'm required to remind you that everyone present that this meeting will be recorded and that the recording will subsequently be made available for public listening. Now, as we said before, what we've got to go through is the papers here, really to consider the issues here, any questions on any of the papers, and if you don't have sufficient information, then we've got to decide how we're going to manage this. So if I could ask members to go through the papers. I think probably the first issue, really important one, is on page 9, which is the notice of review. I believe it's on page 9. As long as the index is correct, then it'll be on page 9. Any questions on the notice of review? No. There is a question which I have myself on page 14, just the sort of general policy 17, where GP 17's decided it's mixed use. So I wonder if you could just explain to me about mixed use.
Again, we are going back to the previous plan, but mixed use areas were ones which had different activities going on within them and weren't identified for a specific single purpose. And where you have a proposal for introducing residential elements, then the previous policy was General Policy 17 to assess whether that was going to be acceptable. Obviously, that has moved on since, but that's how it was correct at the time that the application was determined.
So being absolutely clear, we really discount that and look at the policies now of the LDP. That's basically what you're telling us.
Yes, it is going to be an unusual situation for the next few months until you're getting decisions which are coming through made under the LDP. There's always going to be about a three-month lag while we catch up with that. But yes, the advice from the Scottish Government is quite clear. They consider that the local review bodies throughout Scotland are looking at applications de novo, in other words, from scratch, so that it's not simply a case of just reviewing the decision that was made by the appointed officer at that time. You are making a fresh decision. That being the case, you have to look at it under the LDP policies and not the ones which was actually determined under. So you're looking at the equivalent or the nearest equivalent policies which are applicable.
Okay, thank you very much. The next thing to look at, I think, is any questions on the report on handling. It's on page 19. Members? Councillor Blake.
Yeah, just one. I didn't actually see it in the papers. Could you tell at the site just now, is it open for part of the year or is it 12 months?
Interestingly, when I got these papers, that was the thing I went looking for as well, is where was the original permission? If you look on, it's page 20, you've clearly got reference from 1993 for an application for an extension to the existing holiday static and touring park, but there's no reference when the original permission was granted and indeed whether there was any restrictions on that. So I did actually get in contact with the appointed officer yesterday to try and get some further information on that. I'm informed that whilst they can't hand on heart say that there is no permission, they were unable to find an original permission. Now that doesn't mean it's unauthorized, it just means that the records are perhaps incomplete. In those circumstances, certainly there's no doubt that it is an authorized use in that some 21 years since there was an application for an extension to the Carron Park. So that being the case, it's certainly immune from any enforcement action. That appears to be a long-standing use. But there's no evidence of any planning condition restricting the actual opening of the site. In those circumstances, the best that you can do is actually go to the site license. And there is a copy of the environmental health site license in your papers. And you'll see that on page 59 it starts. And it's quite clear from my reading of that in paragraph 3, it's during the period from the 1st of January to 31st of December, both dates inclusive. So for their caravan site license appears to have no restrictions in terms of closure at all.
Councillor Witts.
Thank you, Chair. I'm looking at 1.7 on page 20 and specifically the third sentence, replacement of mobile units with static units which are occupied in accordance with the terms of the site license would neither breach the terms of the site license nor constitute a material change in the use of the land. I would understand from that the replacement of, if static units were put in which are suitable for all the year permanent residents, could be used if they were used in terms of the use for mobile units. Is that correct?
It is quite a complex situation. In planning terms, you're looking at the use of the land. And obviously the use that you can cross-reference from the caravan site license is clearly its conditions for holiday sites. So it has got effective planning permission for use of the site as a holiday caravan park. Within the terms of the site license and under the Caravan Act, you can replace the static caravans within the site with any other things that meet the definition of a caravan, which is basically it has to be transportable into the site in no more than 2 parts. So you will have seen, no doubt, these low loaders going along the A75, 2 caravan sites carrying what looks like half a house on it, and then another one falling behind with the other half. Now, and they come into site, they can be assembled and bolted together. That still meets the definition of a caravan. So yes, the static style caravans that you're seeing there can be quite legitimately replaced on site with residential lodges, and they will still meet the definition of the caravan. But this is what the application is really looking at, the description again there. It's the fact that the use before was only as a holiday caravan park. This would be as a full-time residential use, so it's not looking at as being a holiday purpose at all. It's material change of use. So effectively you're looking at what you would look at in regards as a mainstream residential scheme, but units themselves would still meet the definition of a caravan. So it's an unusual situation. It's not one that has cropped up that often, but I appreciate it's a rather complicated situation because of the particular rights which are granted by the 1960 and 1968 Caravan and Control of Development
Act. Right, okay, members. Continuing through the papers, are there any questions in the next, let us say, sections which take us through to the observations of interested parties and the appointed officer on the applicant's notice of review, which I've got my index correct. 70. We're jumping through quite quickly. Are there any questions? Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Chair. It's really just to go back a little bit on the use of the new local development plan. I mean, could you clarify really what we're considering here is the application as it was, the process in which it was decided at the time under the process that we have in place with the previous development plans. So in a way, we're looking at ensuring that the process was followed correctly and assessed against the previous development plans. But then whenever we make a decision, we have to give that in the light of the new development plan. Is that...
Councillor, that's what I understand to be the case.
That's exactly right. It's almost like a 2-stage process. You're first of all reviewing the decision which was made. Was it made, in your opinion, correctly at the time? Had all the correct processes been followed? Obviously, if there's any omission in terms of process, then it's open to yourself to say, well, that needs to be resolved and corrected. A decision was made under the old development plan, but under the de novo rules, you've got this unusual situation which it hasn't occurred yet, and it's unlikely to occur for another little while yet again, but you're supposed to review it under the current development plan. So it's the 2-stage process. Yes, are you satisfied that correct due process was followed, and indeed was the application considered correctly against the policies in line at that time? But then if you're minded to grant planning permission and uphold the decision, that really doesn't come into play nearly as much. It would be more the case if you were effectively upholding the previous decision, it would simply be a case of changing the wording within the actual decision notice to reflect the current policies. There are very similar equivalent policies. There's not been, with this type of application, any significant shift in terms of policy. It would be probably a more difficult situation to consider an application under something which had hugely changed, but at least in this particular circumstance, there are loosely equivalent policies still in place for the LDP.
Members, there was an issue that I would like to bring up, a question about whether or not the thing was done properly, and that was the one of the grounds stated in the notice of review, which is suggesting that in the planning history, in the report of handling, there was an omission of a 1994 planning permission. I think we maybe should explore that at this stage, because it's mentioned, but seems to be a bone of contention to do with the reason given, the flooding reason given for refusal. I would like to ask the officer to really, I suppose, discuss why that was omitted. I know it's 20 years ago, and the reason was given it's 20 years ago and before the previous policies. In fact, it's 2 policies back, but I would like to just tease that one out, with your permission.
Yes, Chair, certainly I would refer you to page 87, where the appointed officer in paragraph 9 addresses that. So what he's basically saying there is that the officer report and handling lists relevant planning history, given the age of this permission, the fact that it predated more rigorous flood risk policies and guidance at both local and national level, and that the works were not directly related to consideration of the application. This planning history was not considered to be relevant and does not alleviate concerns regarding flood risk at the site, as was implemented more than 20 years ago. Obviously, that's a matter for yourselves, how much weight you wish to give that. So some works were done, but I think the appointed officer is clearly flagging up the fact that the situation in the last 20 years has moved on considerably in terms of flood risk and the level of detail which is now required, and also the fact that you have SEPA flood risks in place, which certainly didn't exist 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, shows how things have moved on significantly. It's obviously open to yourself to regard whether or not that level of work that was carried out was sufficient to alleviate it, but I think you would have to take on board as well the fact that SEPA and the Flood Risk Authority have both raised holding objections to this on the ground of lack of information.
Any member? That's certainly the conclusion that I came to when I read this report, that it has been superseded and demands are made both by the flood team and by SEPA. Thank you. Right, members. We've now moved on through the papers. Are there any other issues that you want to raise as a result of these papers? Anything arising from the notice of review? Any other questions? Flicking through my dog-eared bits. Are we allowed to take into account the fact that there has been flooding subsequent to the application? It's just a question of, on page 83, certainly local neighbours have suggested there has been flooding, and in actual fact, elsewhere in the papers, I did notice that it is accepted that there has been flooding, although the flooding hasn't reached into the caravans. I think it's accepted that the area does flood, but it hasn't reached such a level that it's gone into the caravans. What sort of weight would members place on that? And indeed, factually, are we allowed to take that into account?
Well, obviously, you've got anecdotal evidence. I don't think there's anybody in a position to dispute what is being stated by third parties one way or another. But the key issue I would have thought is the fact that the statutory consultees are saying they have insufficient information to actually assess they're not saying that the site is at undue risk of flood. They just simply are unable to come to an actual definitive conclusion on it. And that's the key issue, I would suggest.
Councillor Blake.
In that respect, can we go back slightly just to see one of the photographs of the site in relation to the houses that are sitting behind it? It looks, it's very difficult to tell from a photograph, but it looks they're on a very similar level.
Yeah, I mean, that is actually a laundry building, although it looks like a house. You can see that the site is very similarly located in terms of its level to Silver Street and the adjoining houses there. That gives you a more distant shot where I think you can see, hopefully I'm right in saying that, water course running along there, but I couldn't swear to that.
If we could come back to that, it certainly would appear from the photographs that the houses surrounding the site are equally in danger of flooding as the park itself.
I think we need to go back to the issue of SEPA. SEPA requires information about this particular plot. I don't have data and evidence about where the rest of the houses are. I just know as a local member that the area does flood, as is made perfectly clear from the papers here. Councillor Witts.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that in terms of the evidence here, both from the representatives and the applicant, the evidence on flooding was at variance, so I was unable to come to any firm conclusion either way. So I like you have to fall back on what SEPA has to say about it.
Councillor Blake.
Another point, it's the letter on page 13, and it's speaking about it wasn't intention to, it was intended to phase in the new caravans, if you want a better term. If permission was given, what control would we have in that phasing in? Would the existing caravans be able to be used for full residential use?
That's probably the key issue, actually. Short answer is no. Under the 1960-68 Caravans and Controlled Development Act, the Planning Authority cannot control the type of units that go on that site. A caravan license would obviously be required, but if it's going to a full-blown residential use, then the holiday license element would no longer be necessary, by my understanding. So, I mean, coming back to the flooding issue, I don't think the issue is the fact that the site is going to be at any less or greater risk of flood from a change of use. Obviously, the land is what it is. But the concern that SEPA and our flood risk people always have is, are you increasing the amount of risk of people that are permanently located in that location? And whilst you've got units there, if they're supposed to be being used for holiday use, it maybe doesn't have the same degree of impact as that being somebody's sole or main residence.
Right, continuing through the papers, members. Councillor Thompson.
Thank you. It's actually referring to the letter on page 91. And it's just, given that we're in unusual circumstances with the new local development plan being the environment we now have to consider things in, there is a point there, the paragraph down, had the application been determined within the 2-month period, this is the original application, this review would have taken place and been considered under the same Wigton local plan within which it was submitted. Now, it's just really to get a wee bit of reassurance that however we decide to sort of progress this, are we at risk in any way in terms of what we decide to do, given that this timescale has been sort of pointed out here?
David, could you please answer that?
Short answer is no, you're not at risk. You've got to deal with what the situation is at the time it comes before you. Obviously, there was a right of non-determination to the LRB which existed, which wasn't exercised. The applicant could have actually sought a non-determination review, but for whatever reason didn't do so. The application was determined. They've submitted a notice of review within the appropriate time period, and it has to be considered under the development plan which is in place at that time. So no, there's no risk to yourself on that basis.
Or indeed, I think, to the process. Councillor, I think you're probably more concerned about that.
Sorry, that's what I meant.
Yes. Right, you preempted me, Councillor Thompson. We need to go on. Any other questions with respect to the rest of the papers? Going on from that letter from the agent. Anything else? I don't seem to have dog-eared anything, so, oh, wait a minute, yes I did. No, it was a notice to myself. It was in the planning guidance about flooding. Anything else? No questions? Right, well, the next question we need to ask ourselves is, do we have sufficient information in front of us to determine this today? Members? Councillor Thompson.
I mean, I think everybody seems to accept that part of the reason for the decision the way it was that we didn't have the information required, and that was part of the reason why it was refused. So if we accept that, I mean, is that where we're at now, and is that, in terms of what we've got before us, is that sufficient to carry on?
My suggestion to members, that's exactly right. I think we have enough information in front of us to do precisely that at this point. But I'm in members' hands. Any dissent? No. Right. Okay. In which case, then, we need to consider the issues in front of us. I would suggest that we look carefully at the main issues, really, that we've got to think about. We've been told that we've got to look at this really in light of the past policies. Was it correctly determined in terms of the past policies? And given what we've got in front of us, the new LDP, would we determine it the same way? I think, have I got that right? That's what I think we've got to consider today. So I would ask members, in the first case, do you think that looking back at the report on handling, which is on page 19, and then going back to 24, do we think that the conclusions drawn from that report are quite clear and are correct given the policies that we had at the time? My feeling, members, is that we have actually teased out the issues that are there. I'd like to ask about the lighting, which is a matter of some excitement to me. It always has been. And I have to say I'm quite surprised that the report sweeps the lighting issue aside. I'd like to inquire about the fact that this is next to a conservation area. What is the ability of members to take into account the Dark Skies Park, which is very close by? Yes, basically, it suggests it's not considered a strong case can be made to refuse this aspect of the development. But I have to say, if we're considering this de novo, I would like to actually tease out the possibility of making some remarks about the lighting at this stage. So I would like to ask our planning officer what grounds we have, if any.
Yes, and the actual developments, physical developments taking place on the site were not a ground for refusal under the original decision by the appointed officer, but it's obviously entirely open to yourselves to review that and come to a different conclusion. That's the whole purpose of an LRB. Certainly what I would draw attention is that this does fall within the settlement boundary of Greetown itself, and therefore you would expect it's not an open countryside where light pollution is more obvious. You've got, just in this photo, for example, there's a street light on Silver Street there, and there's other ones further along. So there are similar such facilities nearby. It's 10 streetlights which are being proposed throughout the overall site, which is quite an extensive area. Basically, if it's not within the Dark Skies Park critical zone, to the best of my knowledge, and therefore it's not one of the sort of areas that you would think it was wholly unacceptable to have any lighting. The type of lighting you see there, it does look like it's a relatively sensible type of lighting that you've got at the top. It's cowled to prevent spillage above the horizontal. Obviously, the appointed officer didn't feel it was grounds for refusal, or indeed those of the LPG tanks, but it's open to yourself as a panel if you felt it was an inappropriate development at that location. You would probably have to look at the overarching policies, which are on page 24 of the LDP, to actually see if there's anything in there which you could look at. For example, OP1, you've got a general amenity, and one of the issues that listed at the end there is light pollution. So if you had concerns about that, then that's possibly the policy to hang it on.
Okay, but we were actually, that's helpful, but we were looking at this in the context of the previous decision, and that's what we've got to consider. So I was, I suppose, asking whether, in fact, there had been an omission in lighting, and the suggestion is that, given our past policies, there's an argument to say they didn't omit anything. Councillor Blake.
Yeah, I think that was my point. It is within the settlement boundary. There's street lighting very close by. These lights seem to be of a suitable nature, and I think it's probably difficult to get the height. I think around 5 metres in height is a fairly standard, I think, for vandal-proof, if nothing else. But I think it's a fairly reasonable thing to have a long-standing caravan park with lighting in the settlement boundary.
Councillor Witts.
Thank you, Chair. What weight can we give to the fact that, reading these papers, it appears that the concentration of lights in the caravan park seems to be of a greater density than that in the neighbouring street out with the park?
Do we have that level of information within these papers?
Probably not, is the short answer to that. There is, you've got the location plan. I'm trying to find which page that is on. Yes, so you're on page 107. You don't have any indication on that plan of where the existing streetlights in, say, Silver Street or St John Street are. I would have thought, looking at the size of that site, having a total of 10 street lighting columns within that area is not unduly onerous, I would have suggested, but indeed it's up to yourselves to decide if that is the case. You've got on page 109, on the following page, you've got identified where the light columns would be. They're not clustered in any particular area. They're spread throughout the site, presumably to provide safety for people coming and going. And therefore, it's not having a concentration. I mean, if you had all 10 lights right outside the adjoining residential properties, then you may well have some reasonable cause for concern. But as they are spread out throughout quite a substantial site area, which is 0.16 hectares, I see, that's, I don't think, an unreasonable concentration. But again, it's decision for yourself to come to.
We're not, of course, shown where the lights are on Silver Street. So that's a bit of a difficulty. In terms of physical planning, I mean, I'll be honest with you, I don't think there's anything wrong with the decision that was made with respect to the previous decision, although I was, I suppose, surprised that there wasn't some mention made of the design of them. The principle of lighting I have no problem with, but bearing in mind that the design is getting close to a Dark Skies Park, and the rest of the village will be LED lit if it isn't already, and that's a very different sort of lighting to this sort. Councillor Blake.
Just what you said about the street lighting, the page 109, it is in minute font, but the public street lighting is marked on Silver Street.
My eyesight, Councillor Blake, is not what it used to be. Is it the green dots? Green dots. Thank you for that clarification.
So you appear to have 7 actually on Silver Street. So in the context, 7 and then 10 for a slightly longer site is proportionate.
Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Chair. Maybe, I mean, the way I've gone about looking at this is really looking at the recommended decision as it was, and I was trying to test against the local plan general, you know, the reasons given for the grounds for that decision, rather than look for anything new. I appreciate the decision would be based on grounds that were sufficient, if not exhaustive. So when I'm looking through GP 17, 21A, 33, 34, for example, what I was looking for was, given the old local development plans, does that are they sufficient grounds given the application that was in front of it? And I think generally I would say that my only question mark would be over GP 17, whereas I can see that from the application 21A, 33 and 34 would satisfy that grounds for refusal, given the presumption against development into permanent residences, etc., from holiday accommodation, etc. And similarly with grounds number 2, GP 58, for example, it's clear that there wasn't sufficient data given in terms of the flood risk. So I'm sort of looking at it in terms of, rather than introduce new additional grounds, just testing those grounds there before, as we go de novo, as it were, to sort of look at it in terms of the current local development plan. So I don't know if that's any help in the matter, but my only question mark at the moment would be over the application of GP 17, and I'm just wondering if the officer would be able to maybe clarify that, please.
Councillor Thompson, could you just clarify for me exactly what your question is with respect to GP 17? GP 17 members is on page 121.
Yeah, so it was just really to tie that up to the into the reasons for refusal under point 1 of the recommended decision.
I think my reading of it, certainly whenever you've got a windfall residential development that's not identified, you had to assess it against General Policy 17. I think they were probably at the, again, I'm double guessing what might have been in the mind of the appointed officer, but my reading of it is that they were looking ahead towards the identification in the proposed at that time LDP for sites within the vicinity, and therefore whether that site here would prejudice the long-term planning of that area.
That certainly is how I read it, I must admit. Any other member? Councillor Thompson is inching us towards, I think, thinking whether or not we believe this to be have been a correct decision, given the previous policies. I would like to know whether any member is against that. got any reason. Councillor Blake?
Could I just ask clarification? The page 16, the letter makes reference to other similar residential parks or existing residential parks in Dumfries and Galloway. What weight do we put on precedence?
It's very much a case of each application has to be assessed on their own merits, and you'll not find two sites which are identical or have an identical planning history to them. So their existence is noted, but I would suggest it's of not any overriding weight to this individual application.
I would certainly say I think we need to look at it with respect to what Councillor Thompson was talking about, the application sites and whether or not they would be prejudicial, I think, to planned permanent residential housing in the area. I think that's how I would look at it. Right, if members have got no other questions with respect to the previous decision, the existing decision made against the previous policies, I am coming to the conclusion that we agree with the reasons given and we think it was done properly. Do we have to have a form of wording that you want us to specify with respect to the previous decision? And do we then have to go ahead now and then look at it against the LDP? That is what I'm assuming we will do.
Yes, Chair, I would say that's exactly the correct procedure in this instance.
Right, so we are, for the purposes of the Lapworth clerk, we are saying that we've decided that the previous decision was made properly, and we uphold it in respect of the previous policies. Right, now members, can I actually draw your attention to the issues that we should be thinking about with respect to the new LDP, and that is really to think carefully about whether or not think probably plan policies ED10 and H7 are particularly relevant. H7, I think, is the one that we would look at with respect to what you were talking about, Councillor Thompson. Where is H7? Mr. Sutty.
That's on page 126 of your agenda, but in the actual LDP,
Yep.
I'm not well enough acquainted with it yet
Right.
to know exactly where it is.
Oh yes, there it is. H7, which is to do with the temporary residential development, and where it is saying quite clearly that the council will not normally support proposals for the development or change of use of caravans, chalets or other temporary structures to houses. In exceptional circumstances, residential caravans or other suitable forms of temporary accommodation may be permitted on a site to meet a justified short-term need, provided they can be adequately serviced and will not be visually intrusive. My understanding is that we've done that in the past, basically to ascertain whether a business was viable or indeed while a house was being built. I think that's what we've done in order to accommodate and very definitely on a temporary basis to accommodate a particular need at that time. Any members got any thoughts about that? Does that seem pretty cut and dried? Right. And the other one that we must think about, if I go back to my notes, is ED10. And ED10 is on page 125 of your papers, members. And I won't read the whole thing out because it's talking about tourist attractions and tourist accommodation. But if you look at the last sentence there, in all cases, there will be a presumption against tourist accommodation being used for permanent residence. That, I think, is also fairly clear in our new policies of our LDP. Could I ask Mr. Sutty about the issue of subverting our agreed allocated housing? Where does that come in all of this?
I would suggest that probably actually falls, if you look on page 126, under H1, because that's housing land on allocated sites. So you're going to be adversely affecting sites which have gone through the whole process of the LDP and have been identified. And this is suddenly an additional site of, well, quite a substantial number of permanent residential units, be it 50 or 70. It would nonetheless, in that area, I would suggest, have an adverse effect on the supply and demand. And therefore, I think H1 also comes into play as well.
My understanding is that this did not come through in the LDP. It wasn't proposed as a housing allocation site. Councillor Blake.
Not that I would dream of disagreeing with David, but going to page 146 on the LDP, it shows the settlement boundary for Creetown, and the caravan park site is clearly marked here within the settlement boundary. There is an allocated housing site very adjacent to it. I appreciate it's not been identified, but if that site closed, certainly without predicting any decision, it certainly falls well within the settlement boundary.
Sorry, I'm not totally clear what point you're making, Councillor Blake. Could you explain? Sorry, it's your dim chairman.
No, I'm not terribly sure myself, actually. David's suggestion that it's certainly not within the LDP, it's an identified site, but there is an identified site very adjacent to it on the map. And should the future of that caravan site be at risk at any particular time, it would, one would assume that it may very well be considered for housing needs in the future. So without predicting that. And also going on to page 147, the planning objectives for Creetown consolidate and support Creetown's role as a local centre in the settlement hierarchy by, if there were a change of use to residential use, that would go more to support that than holiday use.
I would suggest that we've rather exhaustively been through this in the LDP, and the caravan site was not put forward as a site for housing, whereas these other ones quite clearly were, and therefore were adopted. I think what my understanding was is the LDP is attempting to make certain that there is the right amount of land allocated for housing without swamping the area in terms of marketing. And there is an argument to say if you actually introduce another quite substantial amount of residential housing into an area, it might compromise the ability of other areas, which we've decided through the democratic process, sort of, in Creetown, to be developed. Mr. Sutty, have you got any comments?
Yes, I mean, you clearly do have you've got the three sites which are identified there as CRE, H1, H2, and H3. I think to bear in mind as well that if you've got people that we've gone through the call for sites exercise and they've put forward these sites as effective land, if all of a sudden you introduced another 50 to 70 permanent residents in the area, then I would suspect that the parties there may well have some concerns about the viability of their own sites to be delivered. If you're introducing, it's obviously probably a very different market, but nonetheless these are sites which are identified as part of the development area for Creetown. The site clearly is white land. It's not identified for any purpose or secured for any other purpose, but nonetheless its addition beyond and above what you've actually got there, I think is likely to risk the viability of some of the sites that have gone through the whole process.
Councillor Thompson.
Thank you. Just given that we've, I suppose, accepted that the original decision was correct, given the previous General Policy 17 and David's comments on how he gauged maybe the reason why that was included in terms of how that would, had maybe the proposed LDP in mind when that decision was being made in terms of the allocation of overall development strategy of the plan in terms of housing provision. So if we've accepted that, it would seem odd then to, under the local development plan, almost contradict that by sort of allowing it in the same sort of. But that's making an assumption in the mind of the officer that decided to include that as a grounds for the original refusal. I don't know if that's clear at all, but maybe David can help me untangle what I've just said in a way that makes sense to everybody.
Honestly, I can't say what was in the mind of the relevant officer, I'm afraid, but you do have on page, overprinted, I think it's page 22, you clearly do have proposed local development plan policies listed, which include H1 housing land. So a recognition has at least been taken on board about that. And there's other mention made through the report about the proposed emerging LDP and things like this. So it clearly was, to a degree, in their mind. Whether or not the actual proposed allocation of the sites was there, I can't say. But H1 housing land is clearly mentioned.
Right. Okay, members. We have looked at the previous reason. We're now looking at the new reasons for refusing. Councillor Thompson.
Yeah, well, in addition, I think it's probably touched on anyway, but IN7, the flooding and development one, would, I suppose, I assume, tally up with condition 2, or the reason 2 of the original decision, if that's correct, I think.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. I think not to mention the fact that we would require further information and that SEPA had objected, I think would be absolutely extraordinary. I'd also say, just as an observation, I'm not certain that we would ever consider, if we had the alternative in a settlement, of putting residential, and I mean residential, somewhere people are all the time, and you might find disabled people living permanently into somewhere where we know floods anecdotally and which has not provided sufficient information to indicate that we can mitigate against it. I would be quite worried about that. Okay, I think we are beginning to come to a conclusion on this. What does anybody think about the lighting issue? These lighting columns are acceptable in principle. I'm not going to disagree with that. But I have to say, in terms of design, it does not seem to me to, they put it this way, they've been put up without any reference or permission and been looked at with respect to what the council is doing with its own lighting. Had it come forward, I suspect there might well have been requests to take into account what we are doing with respect to lighting of these particular areas. And I know in particular that that we have been being very careful about dark sky lighting. But members, Councillor Blake.
I think in general terms, I think the lighting density is similar to the rest of the area, and I don't see a massive problem with it. There may be a consideration, I don't know if it's possible to put a condition in, and we're in some areas such as Kirthorne, there's dimmable LED lighting, so I don't know if that may be a consideration, but in general terms, I think it's fairly.
How reasonable would that be to state that the lighting lanterns should be conforming with dark sky status or dimmable or conform with what the council is putting in with respect to its LED lighting in the rest of the area. What I would say is that it seemed odd to have a very brightly lit area and then the rest of it LED lighting.
It would be eminently reasonable to attach such a condition to any permission, but obviously if you're minded to go for refusal, then you can't attach conditions to a refusal. It would therefore fall to whether or not an enforcement notice would be served on the unauthorised lights, because although this forms part of an overall application, you can't part approve, part refuse. So effectively, by refusing this planning permission, you're refusing the lights as well. So they remain unauthorised, and therefore enforcement action, in theory, can be taken against them to try and resolve that.
Okay, so the lights, to mix our metaphors, are a red herring. Right. Okay. Councillor Thompson.
I wasn't going to put it in exactly the same terminology, but it was really, if we've already, I think the de novo thing, does that not fall by the wayside if we're effectively trying to find a way of translating the previous grounds for refusal into the new local development plan terminology or guidelines, rather than if we're still sticking to that decision, we don't need to basically build up the case again and then accept or refuse it, or permit or refuse it. It's refused. So.
Well, the LRB has the power to vary decisions, and therefore you can agree or disagree with the original decision. It appears from what you're saying, I'm picking up on the fact that it's probably a case of varying it and making mention of H7, ED10, and possibly H1 and IN7, but you could easily add in a third reason that you have concerns about the lighting and the specific type of lighting used, which, as mentioned earlier, OP1A covers light pollution. So you're quite at liberty to vary it and add that in as an extra reason.
And that wouldn't be about the principle, it would be about the design, like pollution. That's what we're saying.
Yes, and obviously there is a slightly unusual photo, which you'll have probably noticed in the agenda papers, taken by one of the objectors, showing the effect of the lighting. So that there is some evidence. You could probably do the same with any streetlight, but nonetheless, I think it's on page 42 and 41, they've tried to show what the effect of that lighting is to themselves. So yes, I mean, that can be a justified reason.
Okay, right. To sum up then, we are refusing this for the first reasons. We agree with the decision that was made, and we are refusing this on the basis of the policies stated by Mr. Sati just then, which was H1, H7, IN7, and OP1 on the basis of the light pollution we are concerned by. And, oh, I beg your pardon, absolutely. Councillor Blake.
It's not really to be picky on that one, but I don't really have any great issue with the lighting. And surely that if the owners decided to come back with another planning application for lighting only, then at that stage we could place any conditions that we may consider necessary. But I personally don't have any real great issue with the lighting because of the closeness and the density being similar to the surrounding area.
I understand what you're saying. What do members think? My instinct is to add in the lighting at this stage so that we are completely clear.
I have to agree with Councillor Blake on that. I don't see any reason for, if we're actually refusing it altogether, don't see any need to bring up the lighting at this stage.
Right. Well, I would suggest that, are you going to make a motion to that event?
Yes, I'm quite happy to make a motion.
Anyone else? Right, we'll leave it like that then. It's fine. So we have agreed that, and we simply expunge mention of the lighting. Cute. Okay. I think we're done. Thank you very much indeed, members. That's, yes, yeah, absolutely, that is that item dealt with. Right, we now need to deal with the next item, which is a notice of review on refusal of the planning permission of installation of replacement door at Bishopscroft, Main Street, Isle of Whithorn. Planning reference number 14P10074. Right, do I now need to read out what I did last time round? Well, Mr. Sutty, that would be very kind. Save my thrapple. Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Sutty will read out the information, the preliminary information.
Thank you, Chair. This is item 5, Bishopscroft, Main Street, Isle of Whithorn, refusal of planning permission for installation of replacement door. You've got a number of items which are set out in the index, which is the notice of review, report and handling, observations of the appointed officer, planning application form, decision notice, and the relevant extracts from the development plan, and photos. The reason for refusal is set out on page 198, and the method of determination has been requested is an inspection of the land. You've got comments as well from the interested parties, the appointed officers on page 179 to 80, and you've also got the response of the original submission from the agent on that. Going through it, furthermore, you've got the development plan policies which kick in from 172. The main issues for LRB to really consider is, does the proposal conform with the relevant development plan policies and the current LDP policy H2 in particular? What weight, if any, does LRB wish to give to the amount of replacement doors and windows which were legitimately installed in the Isle of Whithorn Conservation Area as permitted development prior to the change in national legislation which came into force in February 2012? And if the LRB is minded to accept the principle of modern replacement door in this instance, does it consider that the specific door proposed is of an appropriate design? And finally, what weight, if any, does the LRB wish to give to the decision of the LRB in September to uphold the refusal of retrospective planning permission for the unauthorised UPVC windows and doors in the same dwelling house? Bit of a mea culpa at this point. There was an application for notice of review submitted, and unfortunately the two came in at the same time, and we had just read it as a duplicate. Unfortunately, they were the same applicant, agent, and property, but they were actually two separate ones. What we picked up on initially was that there was one application for just the door, and there was also one which went before the previous LRB last month for unauthorised installation of doors and windows, which, as I say, was determined last month. The ideal situation would have been able to have just put that application on the same agenda last month when we realised that it had been overlooked, but we hadn't followed due process, which is why it had to be delayed a month and why it's come before yourselves. Just running through the photos quickly, this is the previous situation before the doors and the side door and windows were removed and UPVC put in. So these were the ones considered last time. That's the door which is actually before yourselves today, nothing else. It lets you see as well the context that the one immediately adjoining in this terrace has had replacement windows go in it, but the one beyond that still has its original doors and windows. It was quite legitimate because there was no what's called an Article 4 direction in place for windows to be replaced until February 2012, when the national legislation changed. On one hand, people were given more permitted development rights to actually extend and alter their properties. in most instances, but in a conservation area, all such rights were removed. So right across Dumfries and Galloway, wherever there wasn't an Article 4 direction in place removing permitted development rights already, all of a sudden, as of 2012, you suddenly found a situation where people were needing permission in conservation areas. That's generally taken as a steer from the Scottish Government to actually give more emphasis to those areas. Unfortunately, with this property, the windows were replaced without permission, and there's also a door around the side, and the rear windows were replaced. That was the notice of review that was considered last month. The door wasn't replaced, and that was a situation earlier on this year. This next photo, unusually, isn't in your agenda papers because it was only taken last Monday, just to double check that it hadn't been retrospectively installed, but as you can see, the timber door is still there just now.
Right, members, what we need to do is look at the papers. Any questions on the papers here? Anything that we want to raise at this stage? Nothing on the notice of handling, report and handling? Nope, nothing. Okay, members, then I think probably, do we have enough information to decide this today? Yes, members agree that? Thank you. Yes, members agree we have enough information to decide today. The issues that we have got to think about are, was the thing considered correctly at the time, given the previous development plan policies? Any member? Right. Well, Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Chair. It was just a quick point on the cumulative impact of UPVC doors in conservation areas. It's in page 173, 4.5. I'm aware of this cumulative impact in respect of like wind farm developments and what have you, but it was just given what David was just explaining about the 2012, the legislation that he'd been talking about earlier. Is this an actual thing, this cumulative impact of UPVC doors?
Yes, I mean it's looking at the overall character of a conservation area, and little things can make a difference. If you have the windows being slowly replaced by inappropriate windows and doors, then the character of an area can change. If people are asked what do you think is a nice area of the UK to visit, then invariably people will mention nice little villages in the Lake District and Peak District, wherever. And although the planning laws might be quite tight in those areas, the reason is that people think it is nice is because the original character is still being retained. If there's a drip feed of all these sort of changes, it can have an effect, and I think that's the point that's really been made by the case officer here.
Any other member? Do we have any reason to go away from the previous decision? I would suggest we don't. Right, I'm not getting any dissent. I think the answer is that. Oh, beg your pardon, Councillor Witts.
Just a point for clarification, because on page 173, the same paragraph that Councillor Thompson alluded to, 4.3, it says here we have, although this property is not listed, the property next to this side, next to the path leading to this property's rear garden is B listed, while the others southeast of this along Main Street are C listed. That's quite a mixture, I may say, but I take it that the fact that it is all these buildings are within a conservation area, overrides the fact of how they are listed. It doesn't matter whether they're B, C, or whatever. It just, I say, am I correct? Yes, you're nodding. You're correct, but it's strange that there's such a jumble of different categories of listing in in close proximity.
My understanding is that since 2012, the critical issue is that the conservation area, it's about development rights within an area which has been deemed to be attractive, and therefore we're being careful of all properties within that regardless of their listing, is what I think is the case. I think we've got to concentrate on the policies and that have been decided upon, and then apply them fairly. We've been applying these sort of rules across the region, and actually I think it's important that we are consistent. Members? Anything else? Do we agree to go with the previous decision for the same reasons? But do we then need to consider and go on into the next section? Councillor Thompson.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the original decision seems to, well, we don't know, I suppose, if the original door was beyond reasonable repair or not now because it's been replaced.
No, the original door is still there, and
Oh, sorry.
you know that the windows have all been replaced. A side door has been replaced, but consistently in these photos, it's that yellow door that is there. I personally have not gone and inspected it, but certainly in all of these photos taken over a considerable period of time, it still appears externally to be functional and attractive door. It doesn't appear to, if there are issues in terms of swelling, I mean, I know from my own house at home, in the winter sometimes it is difficult to get doors open and closed when they're timber. That's a fact of life, but a good joiner can help plane things down and make things work operationally. I don't think the case has been made that it is beyond repair to justify its removal.
Okay, members? So we agree to go with the previous decision. Do we need then to take it forward like we did last time round and look at the other policies with respect to what has come in with the LDP? Can you assist us with that, please?
Yes, in fact, the situation becomes simpler because before you had, you'll notice there's structure plan policy E8, Wigtown Local Plan General Policies 19 and 50. The rest of it is still applicable in terms of the Supplementary Planning Guidance number 2 and SHEP, but I would suggest that you could actually just simplify it down to HE2, Local Development Plan Policy HE2.
So we would justify our decision today on the basis of HE2. Members agreed with that? Thank you very much. Just as an aside, I went to a lecture about somebody talking about windows, and what Robert Adam used to refer to with the play of shadows and on the front was movement. And what happens when you get a flat profile like that is you lose the sense of movement in a building. That's flat there, and if you go onto the previous one, you can actually see there. Yes, there. You have shadows, and that gives you a sense of depth to the front of the, and you don't really think about it until you suddenly say to yourself, "What's wrong with that house?" And that's I think what happens with all of these. We are mending these slowly in Kirkcudbright. Councillor Blake, then Councillor Groom.
Just while we're on that photograph, I appreciate it's not this decision. The neighbouring house would appear to be UPVC windows, and probably a lot of that streetscape is. What do we do in that situation?
Well, those that were legitimately installed prior to the change in legislation in 2012, there is nothing we can do about it except actually encourage people when they come to consider replacing them to use a more appropriate style. The ones here, which obviously LRB made a decision on, we then have to now operationally decide, is this one to pursue for enforcement action? But ones which are legitimate and were installed under permitted development rights that existed at the time, can't do anything about it.
There's an argument to say that if you live in a conservation area and you are eventually, that becomes a more desirable area because it is more carefully looked after. And eventually, I accept in the transitional process, it does seem to be unfair, but I think at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is preserve.
And certainly this is predicated by a change in national legislation, and the fairness or otherwise of it is something which is frequently mentioned. But nonetheless, that's the legislation which has changed, and as a council, we've been keen to draw a line in the sand and try and progress forward, concentrating on the conservation areas, but accepting in non-conservation areas and in non-listed buildings, fair game.
Those windows that are the sash windows that are currently there, could they be replaced by UPVC sash windows?
Well, basically they have replaced, that was the previous windows which were timber sash and case. They have replaced them, as you can see in these photos, with UPVC. That's what was considered to be unacceptable. But in a conservation area, as opposed to a listed building, I think is an absolute. You can't properly use an inappropriate material in there. But in a conservation area, if you have got properly designed and operating sash and case windows made of UPVC, and they do exist, I can show you some just down the street, they are fine.
I will say the meeting is closed, everybody. Yes.
Yeah, it was